In a lot of ways, the order of finishing doesn't wholly matter so long as it applies the principles that we can hide where we start and end stitches while securing them strongly enough. For now, it's practically a case of felling together all of the lining or silicea which is basted to some other lining or silicea. However, you really want to start with the curtain and pockets, so that the stitches can be fastened up underneath the waistband lining out of sight. We can take out the basting as and when it becomes redundant if we want, reduces the workload later. Felling the rear side of the pockets, the silicea should already be basted properly, so we just need a neat fell. Start at the bottom, fastening the thread to the inlay, preferably on the horizontal, jutting out from the bottom of the pocket 1 cm or so, felling across, then up the folded edge. Again, getting to the curtain, still felling it to the trousers inlay if convenient, but no stress if only to the curtain. Fastening under the waistband out of sight. Felling the curtain to the fly is still the very simple case of fastening the thread unobtrusively at the bottom and felling the folded edge of the curtain to the silicea of the fly, still fastening out of mind under the waistband. We should start the waistband near the hook on the bottom, fastening the thread and make headway towards the first corner of the side nestled in the hook. Start filling up the silicea, and we can only get a few stitches before we hit the hook. Go under the hook and under the fabric if possible, and with the recommended standard hook, with the hole, make a couple of stitches in there. Under the hook again and fell up the remainder of the silicea, around the corner and fell all along the waistband. All the way up the front, we're keeping the silicea tight into the cove of said hook. At any point of the finishing of the waistband, we can take out some of the basting in order to move the seam so that we can straighten it, making it more level than maybe it was. At the centre back of the waistband, where we have the overlap, we don't need to fell that down. There's nothing stopping you, but it's no bother. Leaving it open also gives greater flexibility. At the bearer, just finish felling the top of the waistband, fastening the thread underneath the salisha. Do the bottom side of the waistband, starting from underneath the bearer's salisha, and simply fel all the way across to where we started. When we get to the pleats, we should fel through as much of the salisha as possible without straining ourselves, but also tacking the top of the pleats together at the centre back. At the bottom of the fly bearer, start with fastening the bit you folded up behind the fly and guard earlier. Cross or blanket stitch it, tack it even. Make sure that nothing you don't want visible isn't visible, basically. I'm cross-stitching across, and when I get to the end, I sort of do a tack before moving on, so without cutting and starting a new thread. Proceed then to prick stitch it to the seam allowance. We could also, or in lieu of that, fel the guard salisha to the trouser lining. Getting to the top, level with the bottom of the curtain, I'm prick stitching across my folded edge, stitching the salisha to the curtain. Then you get to the curtain, just fel it to that, then the waistband lining. At the top of the waistband, fel across the top of the guard lining to the waistband. Finally, down a little beyond where we cut the machining stitch, securing the thread in place. We chalked where we had cut the seam on the bearer, so chalk those onto the salisha and chalk on the waistband seam. We'll cut the salisha like a pocket opening, cutting a small hole in the centre and cutting towards both sides of the hole, stopping short to cut miters, making sure we have a bit of space before the pressed up seam allowance inside, and only the pressed open seam that we cut down is visible through the hole that we're making, which is where the chalk markings come in. We need to fold the small amounts of salisha under themselves up into the corners that we cut so that the raw edges aren't exposed. We need to press them in place since we can't really baste them down, but come to think of it, we should have basted around where the hole was going to be. Might have been easier. Bear with, this is literally the first time I made this kind of hole. Never even seen it done, just seen the result. I tried using my scissors to poke the seams underneath themselves. We should use our button to check that the hole is big enough before felling and tacking the perimeter. We're going to cut the waistband seam, so we need to secure either side. I would suggest felling all four sides of our rectangle of silesia to the bearer and waistband seam allowances before doing the tacks. But I did the tack first, felled across the second side, and then felled the rest. While the tacks holding either side of the hole together should be visible from the outside, we don't want the felling visible, as is the norm for both. Once secure, we can cut open the hole. Snip the waistband stitching between the tacks, open, clearing it away as though it were never sewn. Final check that it's big enough for your button. Do up the zip and hook and bar to find the position of the button. Use chalk holding the buttonhole down and mark the point of the bearer's hole furthest away from its trouser. We know the vertical location of the button, level with the waistband seam. I'll link off the Murray Sidwell button video, so I will gloss over actually attaching the button myself. Doing up the button and hook to make sure it is in the right place. The button is there to take some strain off of the zip and hook and stop the waistband on the bearer from poking out above the waistband in front of it. You'll also fasten the curtain down from inside the pleat, secure it to the inlay at the back, to the back pockets or just the darts as appropriate, and keep the tacks kind of subtle. Now we'll prick stitch the pocket opening. It might have been easier earlier, but we'll leave it to now because this is how it's done. A lot of tailor shops have dedicated finishers, hand sewing experts. You can do these little bits when they first come up, but it's better for me to structure this, doing it as a finishing section. Get scot of any thread markings that are in the way. Start with a bar tack at the bottom or top of the pocket. Stitch through everything, giving either side of the bar maximum purchase to hold the two together. Then coil the thread around the bar gently, pulling the thread away from where you started. Finishing the bar and starting the prick stitch up the pocket opening, maybe half a centimetre from the edge, finishing in the same manner we started. The prick isn't just for decoration, it's to hold and set the edge. It will stop the facing from peeking out from behind the front of the trouser, in the exact same way that the basting is right now. Prick stitching, make sure you catch through the facing, otherwise it's basically half worthless. I can't see the needle showing in the footage, but it's definitely visible taking a prick of the facing to hold it down. Bar tack at the other end of the pocket and fasten the thread somehow neatly. I defer to you. Clear the remaining thread marks and basting just to neaten it up. We should have prepared the J-stitch earlier, like I mentioned probably an hour ago. For both of us actually. To prepare it, we need to baste the fly to the trouser. Easiest over a ham or sleeve board since the back trouser wants to be in the way behind it. Make sure that the fly and the trouser are flat together. We don't want either pulling or rumpling the other. And we don't want the trouser to be eased almost at all between the stitch and the centre front. I'm not pulling the trouser fabric over the fly, I'm just making sure there is little to no ease. I'm tapering the seam as I get towards the notch. We absolutely should chalk the J-stitch on to follow a line. The generic measurement is 3.5 centimeters at the top, and the same all the way down until it curves into the bottom of the seam where the notch is. Interestingly, the math says that our prick stitch should be just about hidden in the same way as the sink stitch between the solution on the fly. Doesn't seem to work out that way most of the time though. So this time I'm measuring how far the solution on the fly is from the edge, and measuring the same amount from the front of the trouser. Try to make as fine a line as possible so that you can follow it with pricks most easily. Having finally prepared it, now is actually time to finish the J-stitch. Secure the thread out of the way on the inside. Just prick stitch along that line, fixing the fly to the front trouser. When we get to the top of the seat seam where the J-stitch should be ending, we will do a bar tack in order to keep them securely together. Make a few stitches across everything. Coil the thread around the bar gently, using the blunt side of the needle underneath the bar, pulling the thread away from where we started, but pushing the thread up the bar a little bit with our finger, pulling the coil tight, and we only need to make 3 or 4 coils this way. I'm securing the thread by doing a few pricks back up my J-stitch and cutting away the tailing end, though we could also send the needle to the reverse to secure and hide it as discreetly as possible on the fly or bearer. On the fly side on the center front, we need to prick stitch down to the notch. Start at the waistband and bar tack between the waistband and the fabric. Tack through everything to make a bar and coil around it. And this might have been my best example of making a bar tack if it weren't so grainy. Prick stitch right along the edge all the way down to the notch and just secure the thread. Again, like the pockets, it's to fix the seam so that it stays bled into the wrong side and doesn't become visible at any point. So we need to sew through all the layers to fix them together properly. At the bottom, secure and hide the thread anywhere you happen to see fit. We need to prick stitch the fabric that we rolled towards the zip on the bearer side. Fasten the thread somewhere discreetly at the top of the waistband. Send the needle to the front and right along the edge of the folded up fabric, prick stitch the fabric to the zip tape. Doesn't really matter if we take more, but we don't want this stitch to be visible on the back. When we get to the bottom, again, we're just securing the thread discreetly. We need to tack the flying barrow together. Just sew a bar tack near the bottom of the flying barrow. I say about level with the bottom stop of the zip. At the fork, you'll fasten the seam allowances and sticky out bits of the inside leg inlay to the inside leg inlay. Sew the seam allowance up to the inlay too, and don't catch the outside trouser. If we'd overlocked the pieces, then we could cross stitch over following the ½ centimeter seam that is overlocked. We'd almost always cover the fork with something, so aesthetic it does not need to be. We could either trim down any of the side seam inlay that's sticking out from the seam allowance, or just cross stitch it down to the rest of the seam allowance. Cross stitch both sides, obviously, without catching the outside trouser fabric, only stitching the seams to the inlay and seam allowance. We can skip across the seam instead of starting and ending two different stitches. It's the kind of thing and philosophy that of saving a few seconds with each pair adding up over time. If you did this for a living, it's helpful. In my situation, it almost doesn't matter. On the top of the fork, we need to make a square of lining. With a piece of lining about 16 by 30 centimeters, fold it in half inside out, or enough to create a 14 by 14 centimeter square. Essentially, measure from under the fly to the inside leg seams. Double that, and that's about the dimensions of the square you want. Close almost all of the seams so that it can be folded inside out, which will be felled closed. Iron it flat with the seams on the inside. Place the square onto the fork with the first corner hidden up underneath the fly and bearer. Tack it to the seam allowance there. Then on the diametrically opposing corner, tack it to the trouser inlay and or seam allowance. But we need to make sure there's enough slack. Maybe hold it to a position on the seam allowance and pull it every which way so that you know whether it would pull. If it doesn't, then tack it there to the seam allowance too. Following that, either side to the inside leg seam allowances following the same principles. Mine was actually tight and the tacks got torn out 3 times now. To finish the back pocket, we need the D-tacks. Might have done this before I put the second pocket back on, but this is better for video structure. Moor the thread on the inside of the pocket next to where the jets start and end. Send the needle through next to the corner. From the front, send the needle back in at about the same place. It's fastest to pull the needle through only a little and send it back up to the next location and then pull the thread through. Repeat in a semicircle with about 8 total pricks to the other corner. Then we should go across the welts as well. It's a reinforcement stitch, might as well reinforce the canvas. Plus, sewing across we can clean up the corners if necessary. Pull any loose bits of the weave back into the seam. Fasten the thread to the pocket again. To sew up the hem, knot the end of the thread and start at the peak of the folded triangle, securing the thread underneath the fold. Fell up that seam without catching through to the outside of the fabric. At the top, do a small tack, and you could basically secure the hem up however you feel like. I'm going to do a kind of blanket stitch. I'm securing the thread a little bit at the top, either 5mm from the edge, or at the bottom of the overlocking as appropriate. Where the edge meets the trouser, directly above where the thread is secured, take a tiny amount of the fabric, more or less as appropriate for tweeds and finer fabrics respectively. From the top, go along about 1 centimetre and under the folded up hem, coming through the fabric about 5 millimeters below the edge or at the bottom of the overlocking, going directly above to where the hem hits the fabric and take about the same amount again, then along, down, under, and through, and so on. Between each stitch, there's no such thing as too dense, but there's a point of diminishing returns and there's how long it'll take you. About 1 centimetre is good, again, more for tweed, denser for finer fabrics, because of course we are taking less of the outside fabric, so we'll just take more lesses. When we hem across the inlays and seam allowances, we can just stitch to the seam allowances and inlays and don't need to take as much care to take as little as possible since it doesn't show through. We can keep going around like that until we make it back to the start. Make sure to stitch over the slightly overlapping portion where we folded the triangle and secure the thread, proceeding to hide the tail of the thread.